Acting Chairman.
Yes, so what do I have to announce, just to open the workshop session?
Yeah.
Just that we're beginning the workshop session of the planning board meeting of the City of Beacon for
Okay.
January 9th.
We'll follow thereafter. Planning board meeting will follow.
Planning board meeting will follow thereafter at 7:30?
Correct.
Thank you.
Perfect. So in our work session meeting, which will go about 15 minutes or so until 7:30, we are going to, as we do every January, Happy New Year, everyone, by the way, we're going to go through our current City of Beacon Planning Board rules of procedure for public meetings. So really exciting stuff on this rainy evening. The rules of procedure are posted on the website, on the City of Beacon website, and they're also available in the agenda materials for tonight's meeting. These rules of procedure were adopted in 2018, and they have not had any amendments since that time, but we do review these every year just to make sure that board members are familiar with them, that the public is familiar with them, and just to see if the board has any questions or wants to make any changes. So preliminarily, the authority for the planning board to adopt these rules of procedure comes from the city code in section 45-7, which authorizes both the planning board and the zoning board to adopt rules and regulations to govern its procedure. It is not a local law, so this is distinct from what the city council does at its meetings adopting legislation. These are sort of a lesser version of local laws. And it's meant to be supplemental guidance on your procedures. It's not intended to supersede any provision of state law or city law. So with that, we'll start on page 1. The rules provide that you have regular meetings. There are two kinds of meetings, regular meetings and special meetings. Regular meetings are those that are regularly scheduled. Special meetings under the law are those that are called in between regular meetings, sort of on a as-needed ad hoc basis. So you are to hold your meetings on the second Tuesday of every month at 7:30. And your meetings at 7:30 may be immediately preceded by a work session at 7 o'clock here in the courtroom of the Municipal Center, unless otherwise posted or noticed in accordance with lawful requirements. So that's what we do. Every second Tuesday, we have our work session at 7 and our meeting at 7:30. The second section of the rules talk about membership expectations. And this is an important section for each of the planning board members to pay attention to because it does outline a lot of some of your obligations and your responsibilities, that you are expected to attend all duly noticed meetings of the planning board. If you cannot attend for whatever reason, you're to notify the planning board secretary, Mercedes Perez, and the planning board chair of any absence as soon as you're aware of that. One example, tonight, Karen will be absent tonight due to an illness, and she emailed Mercedes and the chair and CC'd myself to let us know. So that is in full effect. Good job, Karen. Members are expected to be familiar with all the materials that are submitted to the planning board in connection with the applications. Typically, the planning board members receive those materials really at the same time as the public. We used to have a process where hard copies were delivered. Now, as soon as the materials are posted online, the planning board members have access to them, just like every member of the public. Members are required to complete training required by law and by the City of Beacon City Council for service as a planning board member. Several years ago, back around 07, 08, somewhere around there, there was a state law that came down requiring planning board members and zoning board members to engage in at least 4 hours of training related to your service as a planning board or zoning board member. That 4 hours of training has to be done within the calendar year, and it is required by law and can be a basis for removal as a planning board member. These work sessions that we have in this half hour before every meeting in a way, were set up to be part of your training. So we do cover substantive materials. As you recall, when John Clark was here, he would provide updates on what's going on at the county from a planning perspective, what's going on at the city council. There were times when we've had a member of Dutchess County Department of Transportation in to talk about public transportation issues. So this half hour is important because it does serve as part of your training. In addition to that, you also have opportunities with Dutchess County Planning, the Dutchess County Planning Federation, New York Planning Federation. There are a lot of organizations that do provide free or low-cost training programs. In addition, members are expected to be familiar with the relevant provisions of the city code. The next section deals with the chairperson and his or her obligations. The chairperson is the executive officer of the board and is designated by the mayor pursuant to code. The chairperson has the responsibilities and authority specified in the code and in the general city law. He or she presides at all meetings and hearings of the board. He or she has the authority to sign the approved subdivision plats once all the conditions are met, in addition to site plans and any other permit approvals issued by the board, resolutions, neg decks, et cetera. And the planning board chair also has the authority to call special meetings of the planning board from time to time as needed. Excuse me. The next section is guidelines for planning board members. The rules state that a planning board member must be recognized by the presiding officer, so the chair or the acting chair, before speaking and or making a motion, and the member shall address the chair and shall wait to be recognized. I think this is a formality that is sometimes recognized by the board, but isn't necessarily implemented at all times. This is a level of formality that sometimes we don't necessarily follow. Conflict of interest is another topic covered by guidelines. You need to be, as a planning board member, you need to be aware of any conflict of interest that you may have in a pending application. And if you feel that you do have a conflict of interest, you are to immediately inform the chairperson, the planning board secretary, and the planning board attorney. In the case where you do have a conflict, you do not receive materials for that particular matter, and you leave the planning board table during discussion of the matter, don't vote on the matter, and otherwise comply with any state requirements regarding conflicts of interest. In addition to leaving the planning board table, as the rules state, my recommendation is always to physically leave the room. That's typically best practices in those circumstances, just to avoid any appearance of undue influence over the board members. The next section deals with non-disclosure of confidential information. So in the event that a planning board member obtains confidential information by reason of your position as a planning board member, you are not to use that information for your personal gain or benefit, or for the gain or benefit of another, and certainly may not disclose that confidential information to anyone not entitled to it. And there's a whole definition of what confidential information means in the rules, which I'm not going to bore you with tonight. The next section deals with meetings, with a note that all meetings of the planning board comply with the provisions of the open meetings law, which is a New York State requirement that meetings must be held in the open, in public. It does not mean that the public has the right to speak at every meeting, but it does give the public the right to listen and see and hear the board discuss an application and have its deliberations. So that's what's otherwise known as the Sunshine Law in New York. Executive sessions are an exception to that. That's when you are getting confidential advice of counsel, and there's several other instances, threatened litigation, where we can meet outside of the public eye and public ear. Public hearings, the planning board may hold public hearings in addition to those required by law. So basically that means even where a public hearing is not required by state or local law, you have the discretion to still hold a public hearing if you so deem it to be in the best interest of the public. Site visits is the next topic. You may conduct site visits either as a group or separately as individual members of the board. The determination of whether a group site visit will be performed, the rules state that that shall be made at a regularly scheduled meeting. We had this in a recent application where members of the public were asking for a site visit, and that request was made in between meetings, and we discussed that at the next regularly scheduled meeting to decide whether that was going to happen. Site visits are limited to touring and obtaining factual information about the application. It is not intended to be a time for substantive discussion or deliberation. That occurs here at the regular meeting when you kind of download all of your observations and discuss as a board. The next section is entitled Proceedings, which states that the chair is to preside at all meetings of the planning board, or in the chair's absence, the acting chair. The mayor, in the first instance, has the authority to appoint an acting chair, but if that doesn't happen, or where that member is absent from the meeting, the chair has the authority to select the acting chair. In addition, on the topic of renoticing a public hearing, under New York State law, the rules here provide that renoticing a public hearing is not required after the initial public hearing. So when you are opening your public hearing, prior to that, proper notice has happened. It's been published in the newspaper, mailings have gone out, sign has been posted if required. If that public hearing is continued to another meeting, that whole process doesn't have to happen again. However, the board or the planning board attorney may require, in its discretion, renoticing of a public hearing in certain instances, like where there's been a long adjournment. So if the public hearing is adjourned to the next meeting and then continues to get adjourned and adjourned and adjourned for many, many months without the applicant reappearing, we can require renoticing. So the next section deals with the process of how an application unfolds before you, and it's entitled Before Public Comment. So number one, a formal presentation by the applicant and or their representatives describing the proposal is made before the board. The chair then is to identify all correspondence pertaining to the application that was received from the public and enters that correspondence into the record. And any written materials submitted by the public during the public hearing is given to the chair and entered into the record. And copies are given to board members and staff and consultants as well. Regarding motions, when a motion has been made and seconded and is under debate or discussion, no other motion shall be received except to amend, put the motion to a vote, adjourn or table it, adjourn the meeting, or withdraw the motion. With respect to voting, a quorum is defined as a majority of the whole membership of the board. So we have a 7-member board, so a quorum is 4, not just a majority of the members present at the meeting. And a quorum is required for any formal action of the board. The ayes and nays of all planning board members' votes are recorded in the minutes. I'm just kind of, because of time, I'm just kind of skimming through some of these. With respect to disqualification, every planning board member is required to vote on all questions put to them, unless you're going to abstain. And if you're going to abstain, you need to cite a reason for that abstention. Okay, this part is important, and I want to make sure we cover it in like the 2 minutes that we have left before 7:30. And this is guidelines for comments at public hearings with respect to conduct of speakers. So these are the rules governing members of the public and how they are to conduct themselves when giving public comments. And it's basically a standard of conduct. So number one, speakers must step to the podium to address the planning board. Before addressing the board, the speaker has to give their name, address, and organization, if any, for the record. Speakers must address the members of the planning board and shall avoid speaking to any one member directly or to the applicant or to the general public present. So there are times when we have members of the public that engage in discussions with other members of the public or with the applicant directly, or kind of speak to one member of the planning board. That is technically against our standards of conduct, and that can be corrected by the chair. And that's really to avoid animosity and avoid, an uncomfortable situation. A speaker's individual time to speak at a public hearing cannot exceed 5 minutes. The chair can reduce that time to 3 minutes if the chair determines that it's appropriate due to the circumstances. Basically based on the number of items on the agenda or the number of people that want to speak, to give everyone a shot. Speakers have to observe commonly accepted rules of courtesy, decorum, dignity, and good taste. Any statements or comments or remarks made by the speaker shall not concern the motives of a member of the planning board and shall not constitute a personal or political attack or criticism of any member of the board, an officer of the city, consultant of the city, employee of the city, or the public. So really just be respectful of others, which is actually the next comment, that the audience shall be respectful of all speakers and refrain from comments and gestures like clapping or cheering or booing. Also, private discussions and cell phone use that would interfere with the comments is prohibited as well. Any speaker that fails to conform to these rules shall be directed by the chair to cease speaking and yield the floor. And this is important too, that the applicant and the applicant's representatives are not bound by these rules. So the time limitations that apply to public comments don't apply to the applicant and their representatives. They're allowed to speak for the time permitted by the chair. The other thing I want to note, communications, that planning board members are required by the rules of procedure to refrain from initiating or engaging in any communication outside of a public meeting with either the applicant or representatives of the applicant or members of the public about an application before the board or a matter that's pending or likely to come before the board. And that's important because sometimes we do get requests from either members of the public or applicants to meet with either the chair or members of the board individually, and that it's against our rules. This is where all the discussions happen.
So that's why I asked you about whether we could make any Facebook postings to try to increase engagement. But
Yeah.
I will refrain from doing that based on this discussion.
Yeah, I think, the purpose of that rule is really to make sure that this is where the record is. Social media comments are not part of the record that's before the board, the record of the application. This is where the decision-making happens. This is where the discussions happen. This is where all the information is shared. So it's important that we kind of keep those lines bright. And let's see, and just kind of wrapping it up, recording of proceedings. So minutes are kept of all of the meetings, and all of these meetings are recorded and available by video or audio, and all of that information is available at the city clerk's office in the building department. So that's a summary of your rules of procedure. These can be amended from time to time if you see any provisions that you think need to be tweaked, or things that should be added, we can certainly address that at a later meeting and vote on a revised set of rules of procedure.
Any comments or questions before we close the workshop?